I'd like to welcome you to this final lecture on Great Books and Democracy presented by the MPC Great Books Program. I am David Clemens, Great Books Program founder and coordinator. I want to again thank Michelle Brock and Rosa Arroyo of the Humanities Division, George Reed of Audiovisual, Kirk Hall in the library, and Jeanette Haxton of the Public Information Office for their invaluable help. All volunteer. Please take a moment to power off your cell phones as I remind you that the views expressed here, including mine, are those of the speaker. MPC is always committed to institutional neutrality and to being the host of ideas, not their sponsor. As you know, our colloquium was made possible by a generous grant from the APGAR Foundation and has been co-sponsored by the Monterey County Weekly. Happily, I can tell you tonight that we have received a second grant from the APGAR Foundation so that we can offer another Great Books Colloquium in the fall. I hope you will all join us. 2 weeks ago, Robert Pinsky argued that the bodily experience of reading aloud awakens our inner selves to an understanding of others. The theater of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides opens, he says, an inward place of ritual expectation where one's own individual voice participates in the imitation of great and important actions. Our sense of a unique and individual self, so necessary to representative democracy, paradoxically is enhanced by experiencing the individuality of others. In our imaginations, we feel the suffering of a doomed Greek king, hesitate with a man lost in dark woods midway on the road of life, hesitate with and yearn along with a confused Spanish knight-errant. Each is both singular and universal, for who among us has not felt doomed or lost or bewildered? Last week, Victor Davis Hanson explained the uniqueness of our Greek legacy and contrasted the fickle mob rule of pure democracy with the more moderated republican systems of laws and restraints. In expressing his view of human nature, Professor Hanson echoed Thucydides, who famously declared that, quote, "It will be enough for me if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events that happened in the past, and that will, human nature being what it is, at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future." Dr. Hanson, you recall, believes that there is a human nature, that we can learn from history, and that life is tragic, not therapeutic. In that regard, he diagnosed California's manifold problems as stemming from a utopian desire to be what we should be, rather than a realistic desire to be what we could be. My own students were particularly intrigued when he differentiated between the European desire for equality and the American desire for freedom. Tonight's speaker, Dana Gioia, brings us yet another view. He will speak, take questions, and then sign books, which are for sale in the lobby. Dana spent time as a corporate executive at General Foods before retiring to write full-time, his true love. In 2003, he was named chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, which had become a hotbed of controversy by sponsoring art, let us delicately say, of dubious aesthetic distinction. For 6 years, Dana served at the nexus of culture and politics, working successfully to rehabilitate the endowment. With boldness and imagination, Dana brought forth the Big Read programs with which many of us have been associated, as well as Shakespeare in American Communities, Operation Homecoming, Writing the Wartime Experience, NEA Jazz Masters, American Masterpieces, and Poetry Out Loud. Dana also produced 2 landmark studies. The first, Reading at Risk, exposed and quantified the alarming decline in American reading habits. The second, To Read or Not to Read, established a correlation between reading and civic engagement. William Carlos Williams famously wrote, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." To read or not to read suggests that failure to read is more than a personal disaster. It is a social disaster as well. Those who read less participate less in all aspects of their community. In the current Times Literary Supplement, April 30 issue, the eminent philosopher Martha Nussbaum writes that, quote, radical changes are occurring in what democratic societies teach the young, and these changes have not been well thought through. Thirsty for national profit, nations and their systems of education are heedlessly discarding skills that are needed to keep democracies alive. If this trend continues, nations all over the world will soon be producing generations of useful, docile, technically trained machines rather than complete citizens who can think for themselves, criticize tradition, and understand the significance of another person's sufferings and achievements. So I will ask for the final time that gnawing question: if reading and poetry have civic consequences, could it be that the fate of liberal arts education is tied to the fate of liberal democracy itself, that the fate of literature is entwined with the fate of the West? No one is more qualified to comment on that question than Dana Gioia.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be back in my native state. I'm spending about 2/3 of my time still in Washington, and it's always just a relief to come back. I know it's the doomed Republic of California, but I love it, and I especially love Monterey and this whole bay. So, you know, if I'm saying it's a pleasure to be here tonight, it's not hypocrisy. I had originally thought that what I would do tonight is to give you a very factual presentation.
Did you turn on your mic?
That they were supposed to be. Let's see.
I can't hear.
I have one on, but not this one. Let's see.
That's the one. Hit the button on the top. Hold it down.
Okay. Starting over. I've got mics coming out both sides. What I originally had thought was tonight to actually give you a very factual presentation about what we know and what we don't know about what reading does. And then based on those facts to extrapolate to the topic of tonight, which is essentially literature and democracy. But I wanted to actually begin it rather differently. I'm going to end up there, but I wanted to actually start it in my own life experience. And I wanted to also just begin by asking you a question. How many people in the audience think that reading and literature is in some ways fundamental to democracy and a free society? Okay. How many of you feel you could prove it factually to someone? And you meet these people all the time because we are now living, perhaps for the first time in history, at least the first time in modern history, where there is a substantial number of people who look on reading as old-fashioned. Reading as an outmoded technology. Literature is in some ways an inferior version of video games or movies. And if these people, in a sense, question what we believe, we do not really have the facts, the arguments readily at hand to address this. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how I came into playing really without having planned to, right in the middle of these fundamental and extraordinarily important debates that are really not simply at the heart of the cultural issues that we're facing right now, but I think the social, educational, and political issues that we're facing right now. But I'm going to go all the way back to my childhood, but so that we don't lose touch with what we're talking about, I'm going to begin with a little bit of poetry. This is a little speech from Shakespeare. I'm sure all of you know it. It's from As You Like It. if you remember, one of the characters in As You Like It is called Duke Senior. And it's not John Wayne's older brother. This is a duke who has had his throne usurped by his younger brother. He is now living in exile in the forests of Arden. And in Elizabethan times, forests are not picturesque, comfortable places. They're cold, they're dangerous, and, one is really living without any of the luxuries in the forests. And some of his knights, are asking him occasionally whether he should make peace with his brother and go back to the palace. And this is what he tells them. Now, my co-mates and brothers in exile, hath not old custom made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? Here feel we but the penalty of Adam, the season's difference, as when the icy fang and churlish chiding of the winter wind, which when it bites and blows upon my body, even till I shrink with cold, I smile and say, here is no flattery. These are counselors who feelingly persuade me what I am. Sweet are the uses of adversity, and this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in running brooks, sermons in stone, and good in everything. I am a working class kid from Southwest LA. I'm from Hawthorne. If you know Hawthorne, if you don't know Hawthorne, if you've ever seen Pulp Fiction or Jackie Brown, those movies capture the romance of Hawthorne. It's a pretty grim place. Even half a century ago when I was a kid, it was a pretty grim place. My dad is Sicilian, didn't speak English till he went to school. My mother's Mexican, and all of my relatives essentially spoke English with an accent, if they spoke it at all. And some of them, the older people, didn't speak it at all. And I was raised in, sort of this working class, Latin, Catholic, group where, really the highest aspiration you could possibly have would be to get into an electrician's union or a carpenter's union, because, that was a good job. And I was sort of the odd kid out in that at an early age, I began to read seriously. I think part of it had to do with my mother, who, even though she didn't have much education, loved poetry. And she was of a generation where people had still memorized poems by heart. And so my mother, would often recite poems or read me poems. And some of the poems are, not poems that are particularly fashionable among academics. But these were these are the poems that you would have found in that book that I think sold 2 million copies, the best loved poems of the American people, when people actually loved poetry. And my mother, would recite, "It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And that maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, and we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee, a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me." And so I was raised, in a sense, with the possibility of language, of shaped, heightened language, as a way of expressing, and I'll use a concept which I think you cannot do without in culture, but is completely discredited now: beauty. The particular insights of beauty, which is a way, in a sense, of giving us a greater apprehension of the hidden structures of the world, of language, of thought, of humanity. And I began to read, and I largely began to read things that my parents did not approve of. I read science fiction, I read horror, I read comic books. All the reading that I got in my grammar school, which was a Catholic school, were basically stories about people being very nice to each other and leading good lives. that's pretty dull. I think even to the girls it was pretty dull, but certainly to the boys it was intolerable. And there was nothing in my early education that would have made you ever want to read a book. But I began to read science fiction, Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov. My first great literary love affair was Edgar Rice Burroughs. John Carter of Mars, Tarzan of the Apes, Carson of Venus. I devoured these books. Years later, I read these books to my two young sons, now 21 and 17, and I was astonished at the tremendous vocabulary Edgar Rice Burroughs had. In 1912, a pulp writer used a vocabulary that college graduates would have trouble with. And it says something about the decline of literacy, but more about that later. Anyway, I read these books. My parents were always, oh my God, it's terrible, terrible stuff. But I read for the right reasons. Joy, wonder, curiosity. It fed, in a sense, my inner life the way all of the arts do, what all of literature does. You are guided by pleasure, and from that pleasure leads you to enlightenment. Years into this, a friend of mine said, there's a guy named Aldous Huxley, wrote a book called Brave New World, science fiction. I read it, and not only was it science fiction, it was full of sex. It was wonderful, so I began reading all of Huxley's other books, which had less sex in them, I regret to inform you. But suddenly I found myself reading serious books. And then I began reading Orwell, and then I began reading Hemingway, et cetera, et cetera. And to make a long story short, I find myself, some years later, the first person in my family ever to go to college. I got into Stanford on a scholarship. I became an English major. And I went on to a series of careers in business, in literature, in public service that my parents and my aunts and uncles, all of whom I dearly loved, could never have imagined. The reading, just in practical sense, opened up possibilities of life, possibilities of work, of imagination that were nowhere apparent in the daily world of my childhood and adolescent experience. So I always thought like you. Somebody said, does literature make us, make people smarter? Does it make societies fairer? I would have raised my hand, but I wouldn't have known why. And what I didn't see is that something else was happening to me. It wasn't just that my vocabulary was getting better, that my attention span was getting better, et cetera, et cetera. Something was happening, and it happens in the life of every reader. You begin, in a sense, to create a space inside yourself where you can consider certain things. Reading is nothing if not a sustained, linear meditation on a subject. The subject can be espionage, it can be a murder in a vicarage, it can be world hunger, it can be, any kind of historical episode. But you create a space, and in this space you bring a quality of attention, a quality of meditation that you probably don't bring elsewhere in your life. Now, let me just cut forward in my life about 30 years. About 9-10 years ago, I was approached about becoming chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, which was a job I did not seek. I had never considered myself. I was in California. I had no desire at all to go to Washington and to take over an agency that was just like a minefield. And so I did what any sensible person would do. I turned it down. I said, I won't interview. I'm a poet. I'm a critic. Why would I want to go to Washington and run a troubled federal agency? And they picked a very good guy, a guy named Michael Hammond, professor, head of the Shepherd School of Music at Rice University, a professor of music, the director of a huge international arts festival. He died after 7 days. If you've had the job, you will know why he died after 7 days. I was then approached again. It was right after 9/11. What can you do? if you're being asked to serve your country in a capacity that you think you could do something, you sort of have to say yes. And so, reluctantly, I went to Washington. What I did not imagine then was that the most important thing I would do as chairman was to, in a sense, lead a national dialogue, not simply on literacy, but on active, engaged literacy among adults, reading literature. We launched the largest Shakespeare program tour in history. We did a huge program to revitalize jazz. We created a program, actually Victor Davis Hanson was one of my faculty members, to allow the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan to write about their wartime experience without censorship from the armed forces. We did all of these things. But we did a survey that I had nothing to do with, except, they said, we're sending this survey out. Would you like it? I said, well, let me ask a couple extra questions. This is a survey that we did every 10 years. It goes into 17,000 households that have been chosen by the U.S. Census Bureau from the previous year's census, and we ask them about everything they do in terms of culture, arts, but also voting, volunteerism, civic engagement, and things like this. 17,000 means that it's about 20 times the size of a New York Times poll or an AP poll. It's large enough that we take this group of people that have been chosen by the Census Bureau to replicate the current U.S. population, and we have statistically significant samples of every subgroup: ethnic, economic, educational level, regional, gender, et cetera, et cetera. When this thing came through, we hadn't published any of the results. We brought the data in, and actually, because of the fact that for an odd variety of reasons, that I'm the only person in all of human history to have gone to Stanford Business School to be a poet. I actually know a lot about statistics. I worked with statistics for about 15 years. And so I said, let me go through the data. And so start reading the data, and something was really apparent in the data. Every group of Americans, every race, every region, every educational level, every income level, both genders, was reading less than it had before. In the past, you saw these things, some go up, some go down. And for example, African Americans had been going up because their educational opportunities and everything had gone up. Suddenly, for the first time, everyone was falling. Not only that, the groups like African Americans, who had made the most progress, had the biggest drop-offs. And the people that were the worst, and this is an older audience, so you can feel very good about this, are younger people. In 20 years, younger adults, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, had gone from the people who read the most in the United States to the people who read the least, despite the fact that they had a higher level of educational achievement than the people did 20, 30 years later. We began to look at this, and I said, well, we ask all these other questions. We have a huge amount of data. Let's start correlating to the data. And that's when it began to get scary. Because we began to see that that right now the United States is becoming divided into two groups. I'm not talking about red state, blue states. It's readers versus non-readers. They are, for the first time in our history, about the same size. It used to be like this. They're now roughly the same size. In the previous 20 years, the number of readers have stayed the same, but population growth has been considerable. 40 million new adult non-readers have come into play. So you've got a country now almost equally divided. Now, the thing that's significant is that if you take those two groups, you can demonstrate that they lead their lives differently. They behave differently. I'll just give you a couple of statistics. One is that if you are a reader, you are 3 to 4 times more likely to do volunteer or charity work. Now, when I saw that, I said, I'm not so sure about this. I think it's, because sometimes you'll have one statistic that disguises another. You'll say, well, this group owns more snow shovels than, the others, but, well, this group lives in Maine and the other one lives in New Mexico, and there's a reason behind it. So I said, I want to take out the income. I said, I think we're just seeing readers tend to be better educated, people that are better educated make more money. That's why we're seeing this. We ran the numbers, taking the income out. The richest people in America who don't read volunteer at half the rate of the poorest people who do read. And these are vast differences in terms of income. And you begin to see this. So we published a report that Professor Clemens mentioned called Reading at Risk. This is a summary report, because we did a very thick report, but I wanted to do a version that was so simple that a U.S. senator could understand it. And so we wrote this summary, with the care that one would write a sonnet. Just having one sentence, having the things all flow down, so a very busy person could understand it. When this thing came out, we were immediately attacked by libraries, by publishing companies. And the publishing companies said, our sales have never, this can't be true because our sales have never been better, before. And they were protesting so hard that I knew they had to be lying. And so the New York Times called me up and said, well, they all said that your numbers are wrong. And I said, well, give us a couple of days. So we bought some data. And what I was impressed by is they weren't lying. They were lying a lot. And in fact, what they were really saying is that, well, if you go to Borders, the fact that we sell films, CDs, coffee, T-shirt, diaries, and things gives us a better dollar figure than we did before this. Actually, the number of physical books, because they raised the price on the books if you're doing dollars, had been going down by about 7%. I mean, that's a really pretty scary number. And in the libraries, once again, said our circulation's never been better. This, and I began to talk to the head of the library. Said, "Why are you doing this?" And they said, "Well, we don't want people to think that fewer people are using us because they'll cut off our appropriations." And so once again, we did the things in the library. The book things have been going down, movies have been going up, CDs, things like this. And so after about a month or two, there was an international argument going on this. People basically admitted our numbers were right. And they also admitted that these behavioral things were right. And that's when we did something that was actually really interesting. Because I had 4 people in my research group. And we're talking about these bureaus that have hundreds of people. We decided that we would take everything the federal government knew about reading. Department of Justice, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Prisons, the Defense Department, all of these things, because everybody had done studies. Plus, there had been a number of huge federally funded studies done at American universities. The most interesting one probably at UCLA. We took everything that we knew. Now, have any of you ever tried to put different studies together? What happens?
They become normal.
Pardon?
They normalize.
Yeah, they say one goes this way, one goes that way. And I'm just used to it. So I was just really afraid we were doing this, because usually everything's pointing in different directions. We brought this out. The scary thing was that every study told us the same thing. That was really scary, because it means that the trends were so large that no matter what you were looking for, and we brought out this report called, and honestly, if you are teaching, you are writing, you are a politician, you are an educational policy, you need to read this. It's called To Read or Not to Read, a question of national consequences. And it's online. You can write the NEA. They'll send you a copy for free. There's a summary if you don't want to read the whole thing. You might get elected. We took 47 huge studies and put them together. We have hundreds of observations. I can sum up what we learned in 3 sentences. 1, reading is declining in the United States among every group. So Americans are reading less. 2, because they read less, they read less well. The reading level of reading capability is diminishing universally. Less among older people, drastically among younger people. And 3, and this is the most important thing, reading less well has measurable, demonstrable consequences educationally, economically, civically, and personally. Am I driving you crazy as the camera just moving around so much? You're okay? Okay. You're okay? I'm okay. And the data is so overwhelming that anywhere you look, you can find it. I mean, you can go to the point which is what percentage of people in prison read at a proficiency level? 3%. Now, if you think about this, there's 4 levels of reading. There's proficiency, intermediate, basic, and then complete illiteracy. Basic traditionally was about a 4th grade level. Intermediate traditionally is about a 10th grade, maybe somewhere below a 10th grade level. Proficiency is about a 10th, 11th grade level. Okay. Right now in American college graduates, only 31% of recent college graduates read at a proficiency level. Around 11% of college graduates are below basic. They can't all be on sports scholarships. It's just, you look at this and what you're seeing, and this goes to the whole fact that there is, for the first time in our history, a large group of people who look on reading as an old-fashioned technology. I don't need to do it. I don't need it to graduate college. I don't need it in my job. And you look at this thing, and they make the argument that reading is old-fashioned. What our data pointed out is that something seems to be happening in the lives of readers that makes them measurably different in terms of how well they do in education, how well they do in the job market, how involved they become in their communities, and even to the degree to which they adopt what you and I would think of as sensible, healthy life choices. Everything from drug usage to exercise. Now, if reading is outmoded, if we don't need it anymore, why do we see these trends which are universal, which is to say every subgroup you can find similar trends. And it also begins to explain some of the things that are happening in the United States. For the first time in American history, we are producing a generation which will have lower educational achievement than their parents, despite increasing affluence in this country and despite increased access to education. And the reason for this and everything else is not apparent in the statistics. The statistics don't tell you necessarily the deeper things. What they show you is the empirical evidence. Now, this led me to the next part of what I want to talk about. Well, what goes on then in reading that would make somebody more likely to volunteer? Readers exercise at almost twice the level of non-readers. Is obesity a problem in the United States? It's not oddly unrelated to literacy. That why would readers be more likely to coach sports? Why would readers... Now, when it says readers go to the theater more, that makes sense, right? It's not surprising. Readers go to sports events more than non-readers. Once again, it makes you think about what's going on. And you look at these two groups of people, and the hypothesis, the only hypothesis that I can draw, now this is the external hypothesis, I'm going to get back into some of what I think the root reasons are that this first group of people go to work, they shop, they come home, And they spend most of their lives, at their free time, engaging with electronic entertainment. They watch TV, they play video games, they go on the internet, they go back and forth in this, and they very rarely leave the house, for other kinds of activities. Readers do everything non-readers do. They watch TV, they play video games, et cetera, et cetera. But what they do is they keep them in balance with things like getting out of the house. They are much more likely to do all of the things that require you to turn the TV off and go out, even though they have their shows. They're doing everything else, but they've got a balance in their lives. Now, you look at this, that's, right, readers vote overwhelmingly at a higher level than non-readers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this brings me back to sort of my autobiography, which is to say, I went to Stanford and Harvard and studied literature. Nowhere in my education did anyone speak to me about why does humanity have literature? Why do we need this? I mean, they talked to me about French symbolism, the development of the modern novel, the unreliable narrator, the Spenserian sonnet. I mean, I learned all the technical things, and I think this is true pretty much across the humanities and the arts, which is that our society has lost, in a sense, a convincing explanation for why what we do in the arts and humanities is of irreplaceable value. We have allowed ourselves to be considered decorate, to be an ornament, not to be part of what the core thing a society needs, but instead to be something that, if times are flush, if you got more money than you need, then you throw a little to the arts and the humanities. That's why I grew up, I guess, in the worst neighborhoods. I didn't know a single high school that didn't have a band, that didn't have a music program, that didn't have theater, that didn't have a paper, that didn't have some kind of writing things. I was always envious of the schools that had string programs. We didn't have string program at my schools. But now, that's very common. When I got to the NEA, I was in Washington, John Philip Sousa High School was having a celebration to celebrate one of the centenaries of John Philip Sousa. They wanted to have a big assembly, but they didn't have a band. They didn't have a chorus. They didn't have any music program at all, so they played a record. That's at John Philip Sousa High School. That's what's happened. Arts education in our country has become a function of what your parents' income is. If your parents are affluent, you get it. Otherwise, it's been cut. Now, this pertains, I think, in a sense, if we narrow it down from all the arts just to literature, here's what I think happens. Now, literature changes lives. I can demonstrate that. I can demonstrate people that read behave differently, and by and large, it's behavior that is better for the individual, better for the community, better for the nation. But how does this happen? Now, what politicians would like, whether they're in Soviet Russia, or the Bible Belt, is they'd like to say, you'll read a book, and the book has a direct relationship to your behavior. This is what Soviet literature was based about, Boy meets girl, falls in love. Boy meets tractor, leaves girl for the tractor to increase food production of Soviet people. And I'm not making these plots up. I mean, please, there's thousands of these plots from Soviet films, Soviet novels. You could see it in Bible Belt literature. Girl comes to big city, meets good guy, meets bad guy. Bad guy's bad, good guy's good. They get married, they go to church, ends happily. And that's not how literature works. There's not a thing about you read a book with a certain outcome. If your child reads a dirty book, it doesn't make them become a sex pervert. It might help, but it doesn't guarantee that they're going to become one. What happens is something much more mysterious, which is that what reading does is, I think, at least three things, maybe four things. The fourth, I think, is in serious readers. The first is capacity. You create an internal capacity to, in a sense, consider things that are outside of yourself. Something that's inside you rather than outside you. It's not on a screen. It's not something that's external. It's something that you have to internalize. A place where you think about stories and people and actions and the consequences of actions and the surprising turns of actions. And you create the ability for sustained, linear attention. If we have lost anything among the younger generation, it's the capacity for sustained, linear attention. If you just do an exercise sometime. If you can get a TV show filmed in let's say maybe 1960. One of my sons bought me the first season of Alfred Hitchcock. Versus now, look at how long they wait between cutting the camera. People will be on frame. They'll talk in complete sentences for maybe 2 minutes, and then they'll cut to another scene. The average cut right now, when I try to time it, and there are probably people that have done this more scientifically, is about 1.5 to 1 3/4 seconds. Because they think people are going to get bored. If they don't get bored, they reduce your attention span to a degree where you will get bored. So you develop this capacity. The second thing, now if you think about, a lot of the studies we did are about reading literature, reading novels primarily, secondarily poetry, drama, short stories, but primarily reading novels. If you think of what a novel does, a novel is a sustained meditation on someone else's life, usually both internally and externally. If you are reading David Copperfield, you're reading the story of a young boy whose family is ruined, who's thrown into poverty, has to work in a blacking factory, a dye factory, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And you understand what's happening to him outside, but you also understand what he's feeling. You enter the reality of another person in the dailiness of their existence, externally, internally, socially, psychologically, economically. It's probably a person who's rather different from you. Could be a different gender, different class, different nationality, different historical age, different personality. And that you enter into this and you see their life from the inside and the outside and understand the consequences of decisions they make or actions that are done to them. This develops empathy. You develop the capacity, because what happens, you develop this space inside yourself, right? And that space, one of the things you realize when you have that space is you're a little different from other people. Reading novels, developing that empathy, develops the capacity, and you'd say, well, other people are as complicated as I am. Other people, have this split between what's going on inside them and what's going on outside of them. And you start to develop that. The next thing it develops, and this is something, the older you get, the more you realize this. I thought when I was younger that you read novels, and what novels do is they show you parts of the world that you haven't experienced yet. What's it like to fight in a war? What it's like to be married? What it's like to do this? What it's like to do that? Now that I'm older, I realize I'm now saying it makes me remember, what it was like to fall in love for the first time. It makes me remember what it's like to move to a city and not know anybody. And what it does is, the first is capacity. The second is empathy. This is alertness. What reading does, what literature does, is keep you alert to all the possibilities of human life, whether forward in the imagination or backward in memory, or even sideways to people, people like you that you've observed but you've never fully understood. And if you develop that capacity, if you follow that empathy, if you have that alertness to the fullness of your human potential, I think it leads to the fourth, at least in serious readers, which I would call refinement. Now, I don't mean that by saying it gives you better social manners. Judging from most of the people I know that read, it's just the opposite. What it does, now think about this. We do so much in our society to educate our intellects. What I think that literature does, in a lot of ways, is to educate our emotions, to refine and focus and develop and evolve our emotional capacity, through this empathy, through this alertness to human existence. This process, it's not as simple as saying, boy meets tractor, boy improves Soviet, food output. What it does is it develops this thing in a way, and we can demonstrate this, changes the lives of individuals. It changes I guess you can say lives of communities, and it changes the fates of nations. It cannot be a coincidence, though no one ever points this out, that it was in those countries which first developed the novel and created a middle-class readership for the novel, in which liberal democracy first emerged. And by liberal democracy, what I mean is a country which has democratically elected government, which has the rule of law, which recognizes the rights of individuals, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, the coexistence of people that are different from one another. That first occurred, and now somebody said, well, in 1850, England was not a perfect nation as we understand it, but England was a hell of a lot better than being in Tsarist Russia. These countries, because all of these things are evolutionary. That you see this, in the same way that in those areas, which were the first areas to develop universal adult literacy, in Scotland and New England, those became societies which were prosperous, which were in the forefront of things like the fights against slavery, the various fights for equality, and you see it in our history, and you see it in the history of other nations. What I would pose to you is that we are in risk of losing this. We are in risk of losing precisely one of the most significant tools or activities or enterprises that humanity has developed to focus, refine, improve, and evolve the species. It's happening in our country, in our lifetimes, maybe even in our families. And that is something we cannot take for granted. That's pretty scary, but I'll give you some good news. We created, in response to this, a program called The Big Read. A lot of you have participated in this. We did this, with a great deal of seriousness. We were able, within a few years, to make this the largest literary program in the history of the United States. We have had 25,000 organizations that are our partners. Within a few years, we saw the trends begin to reverse themselves. Not enough. We created about 12 million new adult literary readers. Now, not all of it was the Big Read. Part of it was, I think, a lot of the national concern that we created through these studies. But the message I'm giving to you is simple. We can create the society in which we want to live. It doesn't happen by itself, but if we focus on the problems, we seek to understand them, we create well thought out practical solutions, and we create enough mass to be able to do them, we can change what some people think of as unchangeable trends. The thing that really astonished me is if you talk to somebody at Harvard or Yale about this, they'd say, you're right, nothing you can do about it. It's just going down, let me get back to my research. I was just astonished at the cynicism of the American intellectual elite. But, you really can't look to them for answers anyway. If this is going to change, it's going to change in places like Monterey. It's going to change in places, like one of our best cities, Topeka. The librarian in Topeka took our program and showed us how to do it. We changed the whole program once we saw her, take this. That I think that, basically, what's the strength of democracy? The strength of democracy is very simple. If you create a situation where the concerned, active, alert citizen is able, in a sense, to contribute to the course of society, to the decisions of society, that collective will give you a better answer, than any small group of elite or any leader. And the question is, how do you take the grassroots ideas? The idea for the Big Read, community read, invented in Seattle, turned it into a larger program, was a bunch of Californians in Washington who developed a way of creating the community networks, a librarian in Topeka. And we took all of these ideas, every year we did them. But you can change the course of these seemingly international trends. But it requires effort, it requires intelligence, and it requires persistence. So that's really what I wanted to lead you with, was the fact that reading, serious reading, the habit of regular reading, of daily reading, of creating that space inside you, is something that changes lives for the better, changes communities for the better, that it's in danger in our society, but the trend is not irreversible. And it is precisely organizations like this, fora like this, people like you who have, in a sense, you've missed your shows tonight. You'll never, have come. And actually, isn't it different? Don't we hear things differently when we hear them together? Isn't the very fact that we're in the room together change the way we listen to things, we understand things, the way we perceive things? That is, once again, I think at the center of what we're trying to do, which is this, because if you think of the capacity, of the empathy, of the alertness, of the refinement, which are in some sense all individual, right? It's all individual and external. What goes on is linkage. It links the past to the present. It links the individual with other people. And eventually it creates the conditions which can build a true community versus the kind of just hypocritical usage that we hear of the word community anymore. So I'm delighted to be among you this evening. I'm delighted to be part of this distinguished fora. And I'm going to end with a poem, and then I would be happy to take any questions. This is a poem. It's about, it's a double sonnet. And I began with Shakespeare. This is my own poem, but I take a line of Shakespeare's from Midsummer Night's Dream, which is: the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Which is to say, all three of them are crazy. But the interesting thing about this craziness is the lunatic, the lover, and the poet, they see things in their insanity that average people can't see. And so this poem is takes that as its title. And I talk about two things. One, we lead our lives by stories. Everybody has a story of their life. You're the protagonist in this story. And that's why we need to study literature. We need to know how many plots there are, how many sudden reversals that can happen, how new characters can come in, how seemingly hopeless situations can resolve themselves. Because without this, you can't go through your life, because every time something happens to you, you have to revise your plot. Those people I know who have killed themselves because they were trapped in a story that was unendurable and they couldn't imagine their way out of it. So the first thing, we lead our lives by stories. And the second thing is that what I think love is, what I think marriage, is, what any long commitment is primarily a conversation. We have somebody who we wrap our story around theirs, and love expresses itself mostly in talk, in curiosity, in questions and listening. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet. The tales we tell are either false or true, but neither purpose is the point. We weave the fabric of our own existence out of words, and the right story tells us who we are. Perhaps it is the words that summon us. The tale is often wiser than the teller. There is no naked truth but what we wear. So let me bring this story to our bed. The world, I say, depends upon a spell spoken each night by lovers unaware of their own sorcery. In innocence or agony, the same words must be spoken, or the restless moon will darken in the sky, the night grows still, the winds of dawn expire. And if I'm wrong, it cannot be by much. We know our own existence comes from touch, the new soul summoned into life by lust. And love's shy tongue awakens in such fire of flesh on flesh and midnight whispering, as if the only purpose of desire were to explore its infinite unfolding. And so, my love, we are two lunatics, secretaries to the wordless moon, lying awake together or apart, transcribing every touch or aching absence into our endless, intimate palaver, body to body, naked to the night, apparelled only in our utterance. Thank you.
Questions?
Please.
While he was here, Robert Penske expressed his dislike for marketing poetry. I think he was talking about the Poetry Foundation at the time. And I was just wondering, as a poet with an MBA, what your perspective on marketing the arts outside the university is? What your perspective?
Well, marketing is a loaded word. I worked in marketing for some years, and what marketing could be selling you, something you don't need and don't want for reasons that aren't true. But what marketing really is a study of trying to say, well, what do people need? How do you create a product that fulfills that? How do you communicate what that product does, make it reliable, and create a business? Poetry, I think, is... And I've written about this. My book, Can Poetry Matter? I mean, I'm saying anything that someone, doesn't know my work, hasn't heard me say. Poetry was badly taught for all of human history. They made young boys, in school recite, about Roman battles. They had to memorize things. It was used to teach morals, mathematics, history. It was crammed down the young throats, and consequently everybody liked it. About 70 years ago, a group of brilliant American academics, most of them Southerners, discovered the right way of teaching poetry. These are the new critics. They were brilliant people. I mean, nobody had ever quite seen so clearly what poetry was. They created a curriculum, and ever since then, people have hated it. I think that part of the problem with poetry in our society is that it has been taught in ways which are so specific to literary study, so analytical, as to fail to engage the heart and the imagination of the young boy or girl. And as you go into universities, if every time I give you a piece of music, I'd say, you can listen to this song, but you have to map out the chord progression, tell me the meter, and how many measures, and how often does it shift key. You'd say, well, I'm kind of busy right now, I really don't want to listen to that song. And that's how we teach poetry. So I think what the Poetry Foundation is doing right now is brilliant. They are doing things that no one else is doing. They're doing on a huge scale, and they're doing it with imagination. The poetry world hates it. You know why? Why do you think the poetry... You know the answer. Because...
It takes it out of the ivory tower.
Well, yeah. What they want is the Poetry Foundation to give them the money to do what they're already doing. So they're saying, what good is this place if I don't get a grant from it? You know, and so they were looking that this money was given to poetry, that all the other poetry organizations could apply for grants. And because the problem with our culture right now is they go, my program isn't working, no one comes, give me more money to do more of it. And I just don't think that's going to work. And so I don't know if the Poetry Foundation is doing batting 1,000, but by God, they've got some smart programs. One, they've created a children's poet laureate. Usually a really funny kids poet who goes around the country giving readings. They've created the world's largest website on poetry. Now you go to it and you look up Sapphic Ode Swinburne, it'll give you this. But it also is indexed in a way that no other one is in the world, which is that you say, I want a poem for birthday, funeral. I want a poem about West Virginia. I like a poem about fireworks on 4th of July. It's by topics. Millions of people are using it. They're not using it in the way that, maybe Professor Pinsky, likes, but they're using it. They have now I have to admit my conflict of interest. They co-created a number of years ago a thing called Poetry Out Loud. Has anybody here participated in Poetry Out Loud? It's a national high school poetry recitation contest. Poetry Foundation puts in a pittance. National Endowment for the Arts puts in a little bit more. We have, this year, 330,000 kids who memorized poems and recited them in competition. That's larger than the entire official poetry world. And so it's been about almost 1 million kids have participated in the last couple of years. They co-sponsor that. And so they're doing things like this. I think they're pretty good ideas because what they're focusing on is to engage, people, with poems. So it was really quite interesting. Here's my wallet. No, I'm not going to give you any money. But, I do something that a lot of people do. I have poems that I like in my wallet. Does anybody else, have that, It's a dirty little secret that Americans have this. Not for the most part poets, but average people have them. And there's like 2 or 3 poems that really matter to people. And so I think that, what we have to do is find a way of taking the pleasure, the wisdom, the energy of poetry and bringing it outside of the very small group of people that are the professional poetry people. Because if an art without an audience is a diminished thing. Yeah.
You mentioned that stories aren't one for one. Boy reads about falling in love with a tractor, goes off to save the proletariat. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
But what of the other factors, the subliminal factors, syntax, punctuation, grammar? How do these things affect us as readers in ways that are maybe not predictable?
Well, the thing is that if you think about this, if what reading is kind of creating capacity for attention, capacity for vocabulary, capacity for complicated syntax, capacity for complicated plots, of being able to keep all these things together. If you start creating this kind of, think about this, a way of describing what reading does in the United States is it creates immense intellectual capital. How that capital is spent is unpredictable. Somebody may take it and do one thing or another, but what you're doing is you're creating people with greater capacity, and you're hoping also with that capacity, the empathy, the perspective, to use it a little better than they would otherwise. And the statistics suggest that they do it. Overwhelmingly, they use it in a sense of acts of compassion, of charity, of community, and so, but it is, what it is that you're creating this thing. I mean, maybe we're creating the next Dr. Evil, but it's probably a chance you can take, because By and large, I think that essentially this will be a way of linking people to understand to use Auden, that no one exists alone, than not. But it is what I'd really like to study, and I've asked a couple of people that are experts on this, is the changes in vocabulary over years. I'll give you my theory. So you can publish. If you write this in an article, you become famous. I would hypothesize that, let's say, I don't know the number. Let's say that a really smart person has 10,000 words in their vocabulary. What happens in a society, and this is happening right now in our society, when it goes down, they still have 10,000, but 5,000 of them are brand names. It's true. It's true. People, they say, well, what's that? Well, the guy's kind of, very much of an Eddie Bauer kind of guy, because they don't know the other vocabulary. And so we're down to a very small basic vocabulary, and that mental space is being occupied, being militarized, even by people who actually own the word that's in your head. It's Eddie Bauer's Circle R. Sir.
What are your thoughts on pre-literate societies that produced great art?
Well, pre-literate society is absolutely great if you're in the bush. If you look at, the Homeric epics are the products of oral societies. And poetry is fundamentally an art that was not simply developed, but in many ways was perfected before the existence of writing, as were certain kinds of song and dance. So I think that there is tremendous creative capacity in oral societies, and without question, art in oral societies, because it is the memory technology. What books, records, computers, everything else is in our society, all exists in the physical bodies of the artists. In an oral society, it's absolutely central to their identity and their connections between their past and their going towards the future. The trouble is the conditions which make that possible no longer exist. And so I think what we have to while acknowledging the wonder of it all, I think it's dangerous to have the kind of nostalgia debout, that somehow that's recoverable. But sir.
Has the summary been done for the history and the data been summarized for the big read? You gave us a bit about it, but
some of it was. There's a report which you can get called "Reading on the Rise," which analyzed it after the first couple of years, and the numbers are so dramatic. And the fact that we focused it largely on younger adults, the segment that had fallen off, and that was where the largest increase came. But it's if you go to NEA.gov or arts.gov, Reading on the Rise. There's a new report. The new data is coming in right now, and if you're really interested in a scholarly way, I can put you in touch with the head of the research department who loves talking about it. Sir.
Tremendous talk. Really, I think I speak for the audience and I really appreciate the information you brought to us. So many people, when there are more readers than writers, there are more people that participate in humanities that end up being professional musicians. But there's still tremendous value.
Yeah.
That's I would think that there's a parallel in terms of mathematics education in our system. I'm bringing this up because I assume you have mathematics. There are a lot of people that are supposed to take algebra and math and don't become mathematicians. But the question I'm sure I hear students ask over and over is, I'm not going to be a mathematician. And yet, learning about rules, learning about questions, problem solving, learning in high school how to solve problems. Maybe when you're trying to vote, you might be able to solve this problem a little bit. but what are the facts, what are the important details, what approaches you might have?
Yeah, well, I hope I won't disappoint you by saying I agree with everything you're saying. Let me, however, go up to one of the first things you said, and it's kind of sort of in the background of what you're saying. One of the great misconceptions that we have in our society right now, and this misconception is nowhere stronger than in the university or the college, is that you study something so that you can do it professionally. And this is a complete misunderstanding of the arts and humanities. You do not study music to become a musician. Some people do. You don't study dance to become a dancer. A few people do. You study dance to learn to move, to control your body, in a sense, to coordinate your movements with other people. You study music, and you develop. It's interesting that we finally got, in the last few years, really hard scientific cognitive data on music. But which is to say, because there's always been this thing. Once again, how many of you believe that studying music at an early age actually increases your mathematical capability? And we know this somehow. It's like well, guess what? You're right. And it's actually primarily geometric ability, and that surprised me until I thought about it, which is that it measurably improves your spatial reasoning. And you think about that, well, you're seeing notes on a page, a shape, which you're turning into a physical muscle movement, which produces a sound, which you're coordinating. So it teaches you very high-level hand, eye, ear coordination, and the relationship between spatial arrangements. Think of a piano score, extraordinarily complicated geometry, translating that first into muscle movement and then into sound, and then hopefully, if you're any good, into art. So these things, so the value of doing that. I'll give you an example. I've got two sons. I had a third son I lost, but I've got two sons, and both of them asked me a question. You'd ask a son.
But I would ask a son.
Yeah.
Mine is 5, so. What's all over your pants?
As a parent, I can't understand what they're saying. They mumble, they do this, and it's just. And so my son, one of the teachers, they were doing a play. This is in 7th grade, and the teacher wanted to be in it. He didn't want to do it, so I did what any self-respecting parent did. I bribed him. I said, "If you get in the play, I'll buy you this video game you want." And then, as it turned out, he got the lead. It was our town, and he was basically the stage manager. And rather than having to do dishes every night, while my wife and I did dishes, he had to recite his lines, and I worked on his diction. And suddenly, within that play, he'll never be an actor. He learned how to speak clearly. He learned how to speak with a crowd, and he also kind of learned how to, in a sense, with all the other actors, he had that, the kind of psychological journey that you do in play. You come in there, and by the end of the play, you're best friends with everybody. It's the greatest community builder. If you want a program for troubled youth, and this is really true, we've tried this again and again with gang members and things like this, have them put on a play. It didn't just work for Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. What they go through, first they go through and they these guys are weird, and because we're all kind of weird in the same way. Then they kind of realize, well, actually we're kind of good at stuff, and then we're getting better at stuff, and then I love these people, and then finally they put on the play, and the very people that the rest of the school that they don't really relate to suddenly applauds, and having built their own community. Having built their own community from their own differences and their own strengths, they rejoin the larger community. They understand their role. And these are what these programs are. Sciences, arts, humanities. The purpose of education is not to create entry-level workers for Walmart. The purpose of education, the purpose of arts education, is to create complete human beings who have realized enough of their potential to lead successful, unpredictable lives in a complicated society. You know, and we are surrendering to this notion of job training as higher education. It's disastrous. Yes?
You weren't able to address it, but just for a moment tonight, and it's really not quantifiable, but beauty. Do you address it anywhere in your works?
Well, I've got a whole series of lectures on it. I haven't written about it much, but it's actually the thing that's most intellectually, it's the thing that I've thought about the most, and I've actually written in terms of lectures, notes, and things like that more than anything else the last 10, 15 years. And it's because I realized that it's a concept that's been thrown out in our culture, but it's irreplaceable. And let me see if I can give you 2 minutes on it, okay? When I'm talking about beauty, I'm not talking about pretty. What beauty is the name for something that we give a human dynamic, which is our seeing something. Let's say it's Point Lobos, which gives up, as we look at it, it's arresting. I mean, the first power of beauty is to arrest us, to make us stop in our busy lives and look more closely. Just the power of that is huge. And to see a shape, it could be a complicated, disturbing shape. I mean, the Grand Canyon must have scared the first person that came across it. How are they going to cross it? They'll die. There's a sense of wonder, even of fright in beauty. It's the apprehension of that, the discernment of the underlying shape, the recognition of the rightness of it that does it. It is a cognitive mechanism for understanding the underlying shape of reality. Now, Thomas Aquinas, when he defined beauty, said there are 3 things in this. And this is a very famous passage in Thomas Aquinas. Does anybody know why? It recurs at the very end of a famous novel, James Joyce's The Portrait of an Artist's Young Man. They have this mock debate and about this. And this is the turning point for the character there. And he says that it has integritas, consonantia, and claritas, which would be translated as wholeness, harmony, and not clarity, but luminescence. And what he says is this, that when we see something that is beautiful, we see the wholeness of it, how all these things belong together, the sea elephants, the waves, the fog, all of these things, we see the wholeness. We then see in this wholeness the interrelations of the parts to the whole, to the whole to the parts, the harmony, the consonantia of it. And then Aquinas, with his brilliance that's throughout Aquinas' work, he says, and then we experience claritas, which is that what we see begins to shine into us. Jacques Maritain, who's the best person for you to read on this subject, this French philosopher who fled the Nazis and ended up in the United States, said that it is the secret shape of existence radiating into the intelligence. That's why forma, the word we use, form, also became the word for pleasure, for beauty. Like when the Portuguese sailors first saw the island of Taiwan, they looked at it and they said, Formosa, beautiful. Now, the most beautiful play in the English language, maybe in all of world literature, is King Lear. It is a play in which father goes against daughter, daughter against father, sister against sister, brother against brother, son against father, father against son, servant against master. Gloucester, who is the one as it were, embodiment of virtue, has his eyes gouged out, and is cast, onto the heath. Why is that beautiful? It is beautiful, not pretty. Nothing pretty about King Lear. It is beautiful because it shows us all of the cruelty and the injustice, the violent jealousies and greed and ferocity of humanity, and showing that out of that integritas, out of that wholeness, and seeing the interrelations of these, it radiates what is just, what is good. It makes us cry to heaven for justice, and as it's worked out in the play. You could not achieve that depth of understanding of justice and goodness versus evil without that level of contradiction and ferocity. And that's what beauty is. When contemporary thinkers took it out of the vocabulary, made all these very complicated arguments, they threw out the raison d'etre of the arts and the humanities. They threw out exactly those things which create the bridge to the human being, which is why so much of this stuff is really art without an audience. So it's a huge thing. Read Jacques Maritain's lectures, were the first Mellon lectures at the National Gallery of Art. I think it's called Art and Poetry, and Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry is what it's called. One more question, and then you're in the middle, so I'm going to have your question. Sorry. In medias virtute.
Do you have a take on electronic books, and is the NBA tracking?
Yeah, they're taken into account. Electronic reading has actually been part of the thing from the beginning. And so the increase in it wasn't because we didn't count electronic books and suddenly we did. One of the beauties of our questionnaire is we've had the same questions in the same order for 35 years. I think the device by which someone reads something is almost neutral. If you have the sustained act of attention, you develop the internal capacity for meditation. I think books on tape are great. A lot of times when I didn't do them today because I was, but usually if I have a long drive, I'll pop in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, or something like that, and it's great. Sometimes I'll stop and I won't get out of my car because I want to finish the chapter. Yeah. So, so I think that the technologies. Now, what I'd love to talk about, I can't really talk about today, is the way that the narrative technologies. The epic was different than the romance is different than the novel, and unfortunately Grand Theft Auto is different than Madame Bovary. But that's another technological issue. So anyway, you are poor struggling masses yearning to breathe free. So I should let you go. Let me do a short poem just so we end up on something that's intuitive rather than intellectual. This is a little ballad. It's called Summer Storm. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry and watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars the storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as quickly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the crowd, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word except to say goodnight. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm? A party 20 years ago, its disappointments warm. There are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried, other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life might be happier just by being different. Thank you.
Take a few minutes to sign a few books.
Good.